Okay, I won't bother going up to the stand. But next up we have Lorna Hernandez-Santin, who's also from the University of Queensland, and she's going to talk to us about the protocols for reference site selection. Take it away, Lorna.
Hello. So this project is done in collaboration with supervising scientists, which is part of the Department of Environment. And it's already been published in the Journal for Restoration Ecology, so be sure to check it out if you want any more details. But first things first, we want to pay our respects to all traditional owners in Kakadu National Park and in the Darwin and Brisbane regions, where we conduct our research and monitoring. We acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging, and we recognize their valuable contribution to society. So as we know, mining creates a disturbance footprint that restoration is trying to erase. And it does this by setting a target, the goal of the restoration, which is usually represented by the reference ecosystem. Now, the reference ecosystem is so important that identifying it appropriately is the first principle of restoration for the standards, or at least it was in the previous versions of them, in the 2016 and 2019 versions. And so now let's look at the project area that we're talking about. If you've been following all the Ranger talks, I apologize for the repetition. So Ranger is a uranium mine that is open cut and has about 1,000 hectares of disturbance. And it's located about 3 hours east from here near our country. Ranger has the legal requirement to restore to look like similar to the surrounding environment, which happens to be the World Heritage Kakadu National Park, which makes Kakadu the reference ecosystem for this study. Now, when we started this project, we expected to find a protocol that would help us select sites, but we didn't find any protocols that would do this for us. In fact, we conducted a literature review and we found that most projects do not report what conveys the reference ecosystem, do not report their process of site selection, or any reasoning behind the sampling effort that they do. So we had to develop our own protocol, which is presented in 5 steps that I'm going to walk you through now. The first step was to define the inclusion criteria. Now, for this inclusion criteria, we knew, which is part of the standards, that the reference ecosystem had to be close to the disturbance area. So one of the co-authors, Tim, did a study and he found that the areas beyond the 10-kilometer buffer were not very similar. So we defined this 10-kilometer buffer as the area to select the sites from. The next thing that we did is look at the expected vegetation composition and the final landform proposed. And we used the vegetation classification map from 1979, which was done prior to the disturbance of Ranger. So using that as a basis, we found 4 land units that represented savanna woodland, open savanna woodlands dominated by eucalypts, which had a 3% slope, which represents the final landform proposed for the area. Then the next thing that we did was to assess anthropogenic impacts. And we excluded all areas represented in white here, which were considered as disturbed. And these are human settlements or the disturbance footprint of the mine or roads. With the next step that we did was to select sites. The first thing that we did for this was randomly select sites using ArcGIS, using 20 points per land unit. And then we went on site to assess that we had access to the sites, but more importantly, to ensure that it was the appropriate vegetation type and that it didn't have any evident human disturbances. For this first trip, we identified 6 plots. Then we went to one of the plots and we conducted a pilot study. This was done using the OSPlots method to do vegetation surveys. If you went to those talks yesterday, this is a 1 hectare plot that has 10 transects in it. And so using this information, we calculated species richness using the transect as the sampling unit, which is this graph to the right here. Then we used this information, particularly the standard deviation from the species richness model, and we fed it into a sampling effort and precision table to create something that looks like this. And this table gives us an idea of how many, I think it's important for me to say that because we were using transects as a sampling unit, we then use that as a proxy for the plots. So this table is giving us an idea of how many plots would be needed to reach, to assess the environment with a given confidence interval and margin of error. So we use this table, and in combination with logistic feasibility, we decided that we should identify, eight plots, which is the in dark gray right there. And these are the 8 plots that we identified up to this point. Then we assessed fire history. Now, fire history is very important in savannas because they burn annually, but they don't burn the same. The whole area doesn't burn the same, which creates a matrix of different patches with different fire histories. So we compared the fire frequency of within the land units that we had selected and of the plots that we had surveyed up to that point. And if you look at these, the ones that had the highest frequency of occurrence, the fire intervals with highest frequency, we were still missing the one with the most occurrences, right about the 12-year mark. The other thing that we did is that by this point, we had already collected data for the 8 plots that we had. So then we calculated again the sampling effort and precision table, but using the average standard deviation across all 8 plots. And as you can see in this table, we were actually lower in confidence than we thought we were. Right in the red circle. So combining the information of sampling effort and this table, the fire representation that we were still missing, and the logistic feasibility that is always needed to be taken into account, we decided to use 10 plots with the 2 new plots in light blue right there. Then we took our process for stakeholder revision. We engaged with traditional owners, practitioners, managers, advisory committees, and scientific collaboration. And during this stakeholder revision, it was pointed out that we were still missing plots within the area that Ranger has been using as the reference ecosystem, which is the Georgetown area. If you went to Peter's talk yesterday, he was talking about this area. So we decided to add 2 more plots here, which are the Georgetown is the hexagon, and the 2 new plots are in light blue. Now, it's important to note that up to this point, all the plots that we had selected came from the same random selection of points that we had done at the beginning. The only one that wasn't is the Georgetown plots, which had its own selection process. Based on our learnings, we have a few recommendations for you if you are to embark in a similar journey. Regarding the inclusion criteria, it's important to define your acceptable proximity buffer, which might be very different than our 10-kilometer buffer. It's also important, or we found it really easy to use the land classification maps. So we highly recommend that you can get your hands on one if you can. And to consider the disturbance history, not just the anthropogenic impact, but assess stochastic events and fire history, perhaps much earlier in the process than we did. Regarding site selection, it's very important to keep the locations random to assess different habitats separately. Now, we had 4 different land units, but they were basically representing the same habitat. So we merged them all together, but you may not, if you have different habitat types, keep them separate. I also want to highlight the importance of estimating sampling effort and precision at several points through your process. As you could see from my examples here, this number can change as more information is gathered and the standard deviation changes. And so, you know, it's very important to make sure that you're sampling the right amount of sites for your area. It's also important to keep accurate records and to mark sites permanently or at least semi-permanently for future surveys. And as well, it's very important to include stakeholders early in the process. Now, with this process of site selection, there are some challenges that are beyond the scope of our protocol that deal with ecosystem restoration. Now, the first of these that we thought important to highlight is the restoration possibilities. Not because we go and find all these species, it's possible to restore all of them in the rehabilitation area. So, you know, we might need to shift our expectations. It's also important to take into consideration cultural aspects for revegetation, which might include preferred species, as Natasha was telling us just before now. And the reference sites may not be subject to the appropriate management regimen, which might change the trajectory of outcomes. With that, I just want to acknowledge Jay, Dave, and John, and I have time for questions if you have any.
Thanks, Lorna. Any questions from the floor? Chris.
I'm not sure if you went to this morning's talk, but on the restoration wheel, they've added community values is one of the really important things.
Yes.
And now that's been added to the wheel. Would you change your approach in any way in selecting reference sites?
Well, perhaps like the cultural values are always taken in consideration. One of the steps that we also did was to make sure that we weren't sampling in any sacred sites, for example. This is particularly relevant to the ones in within the ranger mining lease. But I guess it's part of the stakeholder, like bringing traditional owners early into the conversation and then take it from there. From the scientific perspective, to select the sites, so I'm not talking about deciding which framework species might be, but to select the sites. Of course, it's important to get input, but I would imagine that it would look something similar to this anyway.
Okay, another question, Ping.
So yeah, just to be clear, it's not about the species. Like that, of course, has a much greater input.
Thank you. I understand that the origin 10 sites later on combined with the 2 Georgetown area sites. I think it's now you also excluded another 2 sites from your original sites, is that right? You have 10 sites now.
So Ping's just talking about internal discussions that we've had with ERA and SSB and NLC and others, and we've sort of progressed the selection of these sites a bit more. So yeah, I guess it's just akin to what Lorna was saying about the constant need for ongoing discussion and
reevaluation at different points in time.
Yeah. Any questions? John, I'm looking at you.
Hi, Lorna. Good presentation. Do you have any insights? I guess this approach, would it be generally applicable to other ecosystems? Like if you're doing the reclamation in the Barn Basin for site selection, or is it quite specific to Ranger?
I think it can be applied in many different ecosystems. What would change, for example, would be how you approach the vegetation surveys, or other aspects that. But the process of selecting the sites itself, I think it can be generalized.